Hi, everybody. It's Thursday, and it is the final day of the Quiet Year playthrough in my class. The Quiet Year is originally designed to run for 3 to 4 hours, and I've got two 75-minute sessions. So, what I did, as I discussed a couple of different times on different socials across this week, is I cut this game in half by removing just about half the deck, which is a bigger cut than Avery recommends for a shorter version of the game, but it still works. Now, at the end of the last class, what I noticed was that the two different groups had gotten to different points and were a different number of cards away from the ending. So, one of the things that I also did when I set up for today was correct that and move the Frost Shepherds Arrive Game Over card to 7 cards from the end for both. So that meant that we finished very close in time to each other, these two games. The other variable this week was that we had students who did not come on Tuesday, but arrived on Thursday ready to play. Luckily, the quiet year allows for that because no one's playing a character. You do kind of have to get caught up to speed on what's happening in the community of the story being told, but that doesn't seem to have been a particular pain point. We finished with about, a half an hour or more left in class, which means that the full playtime for the class, for the quiet year, including kind of setup, rules, instructions, all that sort of thing, ended up being about 90 to 100 minutes. So less than 2 hours. Plenty of time to then discuss kind of moments of friction, do the two recaps of what actually happened at the two tables. And as I explained to students, that is indeed an actual play. Actual play, before it was known as a performance style, was in fact a way of recapping a real play experience for potential other folks who are going to play the game, or kind of recapping across a longer campaign, or indeed design notes. So there's lots of different reasons for this. And what we focused on here in the narrative recap was the many different ways in which the game can go depending on who's at the table. One group put in a lot of elements of high fantasy, including goblins and a mystery deep dark hole to explore. um, One group was very much a quiet year of cultivation with simmering tensions that ultimately tore the two. In that game, the Frost Shepherds, as they imagined them, were became the rogue elements from the community who were literally transformed by supernatural forces. The call came from inside the house. The other group, which had dabbled in various forms of oppression in all different manners, found themselves on the receiving end of a colonizing force, which they were able to mostly fight back, only after liberating the goblins that they had previously enslaved. And when the recap got into a little bit too much detail, that was when I threw up the X card and reminded them that that was something that is available to them. And indeed, one of the things that we talked about in class in our kind of, discussion after the fact was the fact that the quiet year doesn't really come with built-in safety tools in quite the same way as, say, Yazeba's does, or even the X card of for the queen. There's a reason why we're playing it after they've already had experience with those tools. Uh, But even so, a reminder that those tools are available for them whenever they play and indeed in the space of class, albeit in a kind of slightly different way, is important. And it's something that I introduce even before the class begins when we do a survey of what their experience is, what they're comfortable with, lines and veils, all those sorts of things. What was really interesting about this particular playthrough is I think these students, more than any students I've previously encountered, really literally understood the assignment. In other words, to introduce interesting complications to tell a rich and robust story. And so I was really impressed with that. And what was really, really exciting, as we kind of got through our discussions was the kind of intensive documentation that they had built for themselves to want to remember uh, the story that they had crafted. And then when we talked about the kind of friction of mechanics that require that they don't collaborate on answers, but indeed speak for individual parts of the community, it was interesting to talk about that as a kind of friction that's by design. Uh, and we also talked about the friction of different people at table having different kinds of visions, which was a really good way to introduce what's coming next, which is dialect, which beautifully has a kind of predetermined set of scenarios that players can pick from. So I'll be printing a lot of stuff out over the weekend for the different scenarios, putting them at different tables, having duplicates in case too many students want to play one particular scenario. And then we won't have the friction of, oh, I thought this was a high fantasy story game versus I thought this was a kind of post apocalyptic, closer to gritty realism sort of survival story. We'll have different kinds of friction the next week, I think, which is very exciting. My favorite part is that there is a student in the class that's really interested in these kinds of higher level world or nation or community level games. And so there have been a lot of recommendations on social media. You know, my first recommendation was what a lot of people recommend, which is Microscope, which is a timeline creating of history in that kind of way. Similarly, by the same creator is Kingdom. And there's a lot more of these sorts of games that, you know, flirt up to the edge of, a kind of pure war game in terms of, national conflict, but that are doing different kinds of things. Mike Sell, a performance professor and a smart cookie, uh, noted dog eat dog, as did Austin Walker of Friends at the Table, to which I say, yikes. Um, honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the idea of introducing Dog Eat Dog, an incredibly important and visceral game, into my classes. It's something that I don't even know that I included in my mega 150 plus game list for students to pick from because it is that sensitive of a game to run. For those who do not know, uh, Dog Eat Dog is a really, I don't want to say notorious. That's not useful. Um, but it is a powerful game um, described by Liam Longwang Burke, at the designer, as a game of colonialism and its consequences. And it is a game that's very much about power in those kinds of ways. And so I'm very curious, and you can feel free to throw in the chat or into comments later on if you've had good and safe experiences with Dog Eat Dog, because I'm honestly super duper nervous. I think that does answer the kind of remit from the student, but yikes on trikes is basically kind of my reaction. Um, the students were really interested in the idea of creating a hack of the game, which I basically was like, well, could we transform? How could we reskin? What are you thinking about in terms of what stays and what potentially transforms in a different version of this game? One of the things, and we have some really great students in the class who are document design students, kind of paid attention to the materiality of the game as it exists. This is a burlap bag. It has these beautiful kind of skull tokens inside, and the cards are very specific in terms of their color scheme, as well as the very typeface being used gives a particular kind of vibe. And the students said this really prepared me for something that felt ancient, old-timey. It was a particular mood. And so a different kind, simply changing packaging and kind of colors and fonts could make a transformative difference, which is a very interesting observation. In addition, the students, because they were playing at 2 tables, which is incidentally oversized, that was 6 students at one table and 7 at the other. Whew. But it worked. It worked, and I can recommend it. But they were imagining, what if the 2 tables could somehow play an interlinked game, where they're each playing the Quiet Year in their own kind of imagined communities, but the threat of the Frost Shepherds is not inevitable for both, but in fact could come to either, or that somehow we could transform the mechanics. And I told them that, Thousand-Year-Old Vampire, a game that one of them has adopted, and many of them kind of cooed over when I brought the physical copy to class. Thousand-Year-Old Vampire is being turned into a game designed for multiplayer play inside of classrooms by Central Michigan University Press. I have backed that crowdfund, and I'm really excited to see what it looks like, and hopefully we'll have it in my hands ready to potentially deploy in another iteration of this course. And so we started brainstorming, like, what would it look like? Would it somehow add a kind of competition? How would we keep track of what's happening at 2 or more tables? And I threw out the idea that we could play a season per class once a week across a whole month. And students really liked that idea of slowing down play, making it more a series of deliberate choices, more a feeling of change over time. And that could include a kind of final epistolary phase where, each member of a particular community was writing to a member of the other community, giving them the updates of what had happened in that season. And then maybe having some kind of element of chance, perhaps directed by me, and a suite of additional cards that could be slid into different stacks and seasons based on, what the groups had done the season prior. I'm really curious to see if one of the students rises to my suggestion, which is that this makes an excellent potential essay. We have the ability for them to design tarot-sized cards, or slightly oversized tarot-sized cards for inclusion in the base game in this kind of way. I think would be remarkably clever to transform the game in this way, or indeed to create an entirely new version of the Quiet Year. As I noted to them, the Quiet Year itself has its own version of this move, and that Avery Alder, along with kind of the work of another kind of well-known, let's put it that way, well-known creator in the space, Mark Diaz Truman have treated the kind of free downloadable kind of sequel, companion, reimagining post-colonial weird fantasy, The Deep Forest, where it's about invading humans and the heroes who are going to come and fight the protagonists, the community that is trying to build in that particular moment. So that there's a tradition of transformations for this game. And so we talked about what would potential cards look like, and that included everything from, does someone, take on a double agent role that is a little bit kind of antithetical, or not antithetical, it's certainly, embodying an individual in the community is not something that the Quiet Year encourages or supports. So you are bringing in a mechanic that's much more familiar to folks through something like Blood on the Clock Tower, or Secret Hitler, or One Night Werewolf, or Two Rooms and a Boom, in that kind of, hidden roles sort of variant. Resource shifts could also, or kind of resource exchange could be part of this hack. And also kind of thinking about the movements of the Frost Shepherds beyond the end. Maybe the Frost Shepherds, have a kind of either scale or transform in some other kind of way. It was a really rich and interesting, I think, end to our discussion today. As we talked about, this is a game, and a game that's doing a very particular kind of thing. But that new games transform by playing a game that you like, that you think is interesting, and you're like, but what if? And it doesn't even have to be, as I noted tonight, it doesn't have to be framed in language of improvement, but transformation. And it was a really useful way to note that the Golden Cobra contest award thing has just that asks, especially this year, for the transformation of prior Golden Cobra winners into new freeform LARPs. The Golden Cobra, for those who do not know, is the kind of cradle of many very cool games that have taken their first instantiation in these kinds of constraints of, game jams, or game contests that have very particular eccentric calibration that vary from year to year, which I think is really cool. So we'll see if any